This is the Value Creators Podcast, your source for a new kind of business education, escaping from business administration mode and entering dynamic entrepreneurship mode. We're guided by entrepreneurial economics, which is the source of all growth and positive change for businesses of all sizes in all markets. We talk to experienced experts in value creation so that there's business learning for you in every episode.
We have with us today both the author, John Deming, and the editor, Mike Hamel, of the book Blueprint for a Spacefaring Civilization, The Science of Volition. And the brilliant and elevating ideas in that book are our subject today. So, John and Mike, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
In your book, you offer us a wonderful prospect, which is that great progress will be made in civilization and business, and profit-making entrepreneurial businesses will be the ones that bring that advance. I'm going to read a quote. "The principles of non-coercion and freedom will be introduced into modern culture as a byproduct of the way Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. Profit-seeking companies have always been the channel to which novel ideas have reached the public." That's the opposite of what they teach us, John. They tell us that business is crass and extractive and is the opposite of civilizational advance. So tell us how you see business and especially profit-making entrepreneurial business.
Well, our aim was to see if we could create a civilization that was non-coercive, that was based on non-coercion. And ultimately freedom, because that's the best definition of freedom we've ever found is it's when most of the transactions or exchanges in a society are non-coercive or market transactions, you're closer and closer to freedom. And in freedom, freedom's an ideal standard that we can only approach asymptotically. So as you get closer and closer to freedom, you get a civilization that's more and more innovative, more creative, more prosperous. And that history corroborates that. I can't think of one counterexample in history to that. Whenever a socialist type central planning kind of civilization is attempted, it just fails. And you can take examples. And these are primitive versions of capitalism and without much freedom, but they were more capitalist than the other. You can take Hong Kong, communist China. You can take East and West Berlin. You can take North and South Korea, same ethnicity, the same linguistic group, the same everything. And when the two different societies separated after World War II, this kind of the same level of per capita prosperity. And after, several decades, the difference was so obvious. And I happened to visit every one of those three places, and you could see it.
But when you talk about business in that context, John, even in Western businesses, some critics say that they can be coercive. Those hierarchies of authorities they build with a C-suite at the top and the workers at the bottom, does that incorporate the kinds of freedoms that you're talking about?
Businesses are by their nature non-coercive. I mean, you don't have to buy their product. Nobody forces you to buy Exxon gasoline. Nobody forces you to buy an Apple iPhone. Why do we buy it? We buy it because we think it'll make our lives better. It's really that simple. So at the fundamental structure of free markets is non-coercive. In fact, that's how we define a market. It's all of the transactions in any particular society that are non-coercive, that don't involve force or violence, the threat of violence. So
there's a fundamental principle there which you talk about a lot in your book that underpins those markets, and that's subjective value, which we talk a lot about here, John. But you expand it in a powerful way. You call it's a system leading to better aspects of the entire socio-economic world. So expand on that, the powerful system of subjective value.
Okay, well, one of the problems that you need to address in a social structure is, on our planet right now, let's say approximately 8 billion souls, 8 billion people. Each person has a different set of values. It's unique. It's slightly, maybe it's only slightly different from their neighbors, etc., but it's different. It's your own set of values. So how do you address that? How do you best satisfy the values that are all different? I mean, they're very across this wide spectrum. What interests Elon Musk is very different from what interests or what value, the local grocer or pharmaceutical or drugstore owner uh, values. But that's not saying one is better than the other. They're just different. So how do you best address that? And the only way you can really address it is by markets, because that's a bottom-up process of consumers choosing products and services that they think will make their life better. Now, how do we know that they think those products and services will make their lives better? We know because they buy them. They give up some of their property in exchange for those things, which is very different from getting something for free. There is no such thing as a free anything in this universe,
Mhm.
because it's due to the second law of thermodynamics. But you don't get any information when you give something away for free, because, you go, "Well, sure, I'll take it." Well, smart people will refuse it, because what free really means is they're not telling you the price.
Yeah, hidden costs. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll come out. You'll find out what it costs eventually, and so that's another way that the current system suppresses information. I mean, it suppresses information and knowledge all across the board, but that's one way in which it does it that's pretty clear.
Well, I want to get to that loss of information in a second, but I do want to have you highlight one element in your title, which is volitional science. So we're talking about subjective value here, which people think of that as a unscientific concept, but in volitional science, you say that's the opposite of the truth. We have a science of value. So please talk us through that.
Well, uh, Menger, Van Mises, and Hayek originally showed us how to develop a far more powerful and clear explanation of economic activity by starting with the subjective value. And subjective value, to any person that hears it, is very clear. We all pursue a different vision of happiness in our lives, or better, or more satisfactory. Um, and so it's in the fact that there are so many different variations on value. There's 8 billion different ones. How do you satisfy them best? And entrepreneurs, that's what an entrepreneur does. They explore different niches of products and services. They put them on the market. A consumer can buy them or not buy them. And my buying an iPhone doesn't mean you have to buy an iPhone. You contrast that with a political election. Um, everybody has to accept the choice of the majority. And so in a market, your choice does not affect my choice, other than maybe you influence me to buy a similar product because you're a good friend or something. Um, but but markets have this, it's really almost, and I use this in non-theological terms, a miracle,
Mhm.
how they can satisfy so many different people with so many different sets of preferences and values at the same time without
Yeah.
conflict.
Yeah, that was Hayek's point about markets, right? That there's nobody has all knowledge, but somehow the market arrives at a conclusion. Mike, go ahead.
I was going to say the subjective value loses sight of the fact what's part of volitional science is applying the scientific methodology, the four steps, to things like markets. And John's done a good job of saying how those things parallel to how the to how the markets should and do operate. An entrepreneur goes through those 4 steps, whether they realize it or not.
What are the 4 steps, Mike?
Well, John has addressed this in terms of the scientific method. I think that's one thing that Andrew Galambos brought to this area that was not necessarily assumed beforehand. And John can speak to this, the idea of applying science, the scientific method, to something like economics or markets.
Yeah, I mean, an entrepreneur in effect is doing a laboratory test. They have this product. Their hypothesis is that people will want it and be willing to pay for it, and that they can produce it at a cost that the consumer will find reasonable. And then they put it into the market. That's the test. The consumer buys or doesn't buy. And it's all a sort of a scientific process.
Mhm.
It's not formally scientific because science is not that formal. True science isn't. Um, and there's another interesting aspect to this. Market acceptance or rejection is the ultimate corroboration of a scientific theory. You take a scientific theory and you use it to develop products and services, and they'll either work or they don't.
Mhm.
They'll either work as advertised, I think is you must add, because something can be claimed to work, but you want to say, here's how it will work. And you, the consumer, are going to be the ultimate determinant. It's not the entrepreneur. Um, he is in effect um, a servant of consumers. I mean, the consumer, as Mises pointed out over and over again, the consumer's king in capitalism.
Right.
The schools and academia get it exactly the opposite and exactly wrong.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you've introduced the idea of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial profit. One of the areas where I think the academics in Austrian economics don't quite communicate properly is that entrepreneurship today is not an entrepreneur. We can't talk about an entrepreneur. It's an entrepreneurial value creation system at huge scale in some of these great corporations, the Nvidias and the Facebooks and the Apples of this world. So do you see it the same way, entrepreneurship as a system as opposed to the entrepreneur? Can I talk about a system?
Well, I don't think there's a conflict between the two. I think entrepreneurs are freer to operate more effectively in an entrepreneurial world, in a world that accommodates them. I mean, one of the things Galambos used to point out was, he said, how do you help consumers by attacking producers? He said, isn't that the craziest idea you've ever heard?
Mhm.
We want to, and an entrepreneur does not need help. All he needs is for people to get out of the way. Just leave me alone. And he can raise the capital. He can find the associates to work with. I mean, he has to do. I mean, entrepreneurs are very rare. They're not. I mean, one of the ways we characterize the civilization we're aiming at is that everyone is an entrepreneur, but the highly competent, game-changing entrepreneurs are rare. The Elon Musks of the world, there's not many. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, love him or hate him, and I used to love him, and now I kinda but it's like once he got into the nonprofit world, see, profit, people have this. I mean, again, what I had to do to understand the world was unlearn everything I had, quote, unquote, "learned"
Mhm.
in school, in academia, in university, even in graduate programs. Um, because profit is this really unusual, almost gift from the universe. It's a natural measure of how effectively you're serving your customers.
Mhm.
And so that means that the higher the profits, the more and better you're serving your customers. There's no such thing as obscene or profits that are too high. The higher the profit, the more you're delivering the goods.
Yeah, we
So
like to say it's a signal from the market that you're using resources well and to the
yes,
market's approval. I just want to take a quick aside. Mike and John, you both mentioned Columbus. Just let's tell people quickly about that reference. We can link to some Wikipedia entries and other things in our show notes, but just tell people about Columbus.
Well, Columbus was an astrophysicist who worked in the rocket industry of the 50s and wanted it for the purpose of going to doing what Elon's doing today. And he tried to convince, the defense industry has changed so much with recombinations, mergers, etc. It's hard to trace these companies, but he worked for a company called TRW back in the day that was and North American Aviation that were building rockets. And he goes to one of the executives and he says, "Look, I want you to give me a division of the company, and I'll develop rockets so we can go to the moon and Mars and beyond." And the guys just said, "Look, we're building for the US military, and we're building missiles that can carry nuclear weapons over the ocean and hit Russia or China if we need to." And so that's when Galamos goes, "Okay, I got to figure this out." And
So he was the Elon Musk of his time, except he didn't have the venture capital, right? But
yeah, and he was, he was a theoretical physicist. He was not an entrepreneur.
so how did he get to this side, to the volitional science?
Well, then he started developing the basis of volitional science, and he and then a lot of us in after that have added to it, changed it. It's evolved like all science does, but he created the fundamental principles.
Okay, good.
Um,
Well, we'll make some reference to that so that people can look it up. But let's get back then to a thread. One of the aspects of your book, you call for an entrepreneurial revolution, and I love that concept. Love the revolution. It's a revolution against the universal belief in institutional coercion and constraint. So I have many questions about that. But who's going to lead the revolution, John?
well, they'll be self-chosen, if they hear these ideas and they like them and they want to, and they have the the ability, the competence to build a great company that can lead us into a civilization of freedom and endless prosperity. That's how it works. I mean, there's no central command. There's no there's no board of overseers of entrepreneurs. It's just success in the marketplace. Now, I will say this: we're in an era when an entrepreneur, for the first time, really, I think, in history, has an opportunity to become a serious historical figure. Um, if you think back to Greece, who do we remember? Socrates, Aristotle. We remember the thinkers,
Mhm.
the the quote unquote scientists of that day. It's the same with the Enlightenment, with all historical periods after that. Or we remember the political oppressors, and those will go away in history. I mean, 1,000 years from now, nobody will know who the hell Julius Caesar was. Uh, but people will remember people like Epictetus, Archimedes. Well, Archimedes was Greek, but they'll remember him from that era. And they'll remember that Archimedes was the guy that created the contraptions that held off the Roman legions from Syracuse for that. So that, I mean, eventually they were overwhelmed, and Archimedes was actually killed by a Roman legionnaire. Uh, but
But I remember Rockefeller and Carnegie. They were great civilizational figures, right?
they were, and the reason we remember them is because America was the closest thing to an entrepreneurial civilization from its birth until about the turn of the century. Um, and even though both Rockefeller and Carnegie made it into the 20th century, um, their great entrepreneurial era was over. And this is a pet peeve of mine. Rockefeller gets portrayed in schools as this evil, greedy bastard.
Yeah, the rubber baron, right? Yeah, I've written about that. He didn't rob anybody. He made
No.
people's lives better.
And when he started out after the Civil War ended, he was selling, I mean, kerosene, which was main way that people lit their homes in America was selling for, and I may have these numbers not quite accurate, but was selling for about 72 to 80 cents a gallon or liter. I can't remember. But
It was a gallon.
by 1900, he had that cost down to 4 cents a gallon. And so Rockefeller, almost more than anybody else, was responsible for Americans, the average American, being able to read and take in news and novels. And I mean,
Work. And you could do more work in the barn if you had kerosene running, so the economy became more productive.
yeah, when the sun went down, your day was over. There was no, if you were inside, there's no light.
So dial to today. I love this theme. So I think we all think of Elon Musk. I mean, he's clearly a civilizational figure, and I also listen a lot to Mark Andreessen, who talks about they talk about accelerationism, the idea that we can grow faster and move faster and use capital in a better and better fashion. So those are the kinds of people you mean, right? That they're civilizational figures.
You chose two of the best. I mean, Elon is, in the words of some intellectual I heard on some podcast, a bloody miracle. I have no idea how he does what he does, but I've certainly made good money investing in his projects. And so I'm very grateful to Elon, but I'm grateful to Elon for far more than just the money I've made. I mean, the guy is an inspirational figure. I mean, just think of SpaceX. NASA goes to the moon, leaves a couple of piles of junk, and never goes back. Elon, and they've fired, I think over the past 2 or 3 years, NASA's launched maybe 3 or 4 rockets, maybe 15, I don't know how many. Meanwhile, SpaceX has launched over 100.
Mhm.
And they built this incredible starship, which seems impossible, and then captured it with those, those chopsticks.
Right.
The guy's unbelievable. And he's a prototype of what we're talking about when we talking about the entrepreneurial leaders of the world. He really is.
Yeah. So this idea of entrepreneurial leadership it's an exciting theme. John, one of the things you do in your book is separate the scientific part that you're just talking about, the discoverers and the inventors, from the entrepreneurs, the ones we call it innovation, right? Invention is not an innovation until there's a market for it. We don't always think that way, that there's a market for the inventors and the discovery of science. So talk us through that part of volitional science.
Well, I mean, as we discussed earlier, science itself is a market. It's a market, an intergenerational market in ideas. And the scientist puts his product out there, and it's either taken up by other scientists and theoreticians and technological, uh, uh, you know, uh, appliers, let's call them, uh, and turned into products and services. So there's a kind of chronological order. You just have to realize that these categories, entrepreneur, innovator, etc., are just for the purposes of trying to explain the social world more clearly. You create these categories, but in the real world, they get all mixed up and messy, and you can have entrepreneurs who are also innovators, innovators who are, and entrepreneurs can be innovative in the entrepreneurial business world. Um, and a scientist, it is rare that a scientist can become a competent entrepreneur, because it's really two very different skill sets. An entrepreneur can more easily be a scientific innovator, and I think Elon exemplifies that. I think he's made certain inventions having to do with rocket engines that are amazing, and the way he's innovated the production processes at Tesla are fascinating.
Yeah.
Um,
We're delighted to announce the Value Creators online course for entrepreneurs in every kind of business, big, small, or medium, at every stage, in every industry. Our course provides the foundations and principles on which to build success. Simple, clear purpose and principles, give rise to creativity, innovation, and competitively superior business action. There are 11 foundational principles or mental models that together cohere into the value business model. Principles for value generation, principles for value operations, principles for value finance and accounting, and principles for value sustainability, as well as the new knowledge accumulation you'll need for continuous innovation. These principles are delivered by top business professors from top business schools: Mark Packard, Per Byland, Gordon Miller, David Rapp, and Bart Vanderhagen. You'll find video lessons from them, along with downloadable tools, processes, and other valuable content. Master these lessons, and you'll master the most important skill in business: value creation. Go to thevaluecreators.com and click the course link. I live in San Diego, and we see that down here in the biotech industry. The scientists who are working on biotechnical experiments or biological experiments in the lab often become the founders of their firms in the pharmaceutical industry. So we do see it a little bit. But I'm going to go one more step in your theory, John. For that to work, for science to be a market, there's got to be ownership of the intellectual property. You underline that very strongly. You call it primary capitalism, that we've got to have private ownership of those intellectual property assets. So drill into that for us, please.
Well, this is a difficult idea, and it meets a lot of resistance, even in the scientific world. But if you think about it, markets are this very effective mechanism for turning those who create the most value for others into higher compensation. In other words, the more value you create for other people, the more money you make. But one group has been left out of that process, and that's scientific innovators, because they don't own their ideas, supposedly. And what we assert is that they do own their ideas. We just haven't recognized that yet. And then it runs into all sorts of objections, like, oh, they could hoard their ideas. They won't release them for other people to use. Blah, it goes on and on. But all you have to do is just think that through a little bit, and you realize that there's no incentive for a major innovator to not license his ideas and not license them on reasonable terms. What are reasonable terms? What the market will accept. It's just that simple. And so they'll register their ideas in a more advanced civilization. They'd register their ideas with a registration company that would make them public. It would alert the people. This registration company will go, who would most likely like to use these ideas? We'll get in touch with them. We'll let them know they're free to use them or not. And one of the things that we propose is that there will be two terms on all licensing. And we think the market will ultimately converge on these terms, but it's up to the market to determine.
Mm-hmm.
And those terms are, number one, you can use this idea under these two conditions: no coercive usage. You can't kill people. You can't build weapons of, any sort of weapon with these ideas. And number two, payment of a non-zero royalty, as determined by the licensor and by the licensee. In other words, you can use these ideas. You determine what to pay for them over time. And that, again, those two conditions will raise objections from people that love to object to new ideas. But it's simple to explain how they would enhance the free flow of ideas to people that really want to use them and can understand them.
Well, you had a great thought experiment in your book, which was that this would make Isaac Newton a rich man, right? If we could go back to play that out for us. How would he get rich? How would he use the registration company if it had been around?
Well, to understand that, you must think really long term. And in a free civilization, it will be a long, one of the things we want to do is stretch the timelines out for the influential, important people, the people that make a difference in civilization. It's like one of the hallmarks of the new kind of entrepreneur we describe is that he or she has a much longer time scale in terms of how they plan and think about their life.
Mhm.
And, there are different kinds of time scales. The personal time scale is kind of the longest time scale most people can imagine thinking in. But then there's the species time scale, which is the length of time our species has existed and will exist. And so when you think about that and you think about the past, we owe everything that we have today to the great men and women of the past. They created this world that we benefit, from which we benefit hugely. And the great, I mean, one of the sad things about the way history is taught in schools is you learn about the generals and the politicians that destroy things, but there's very little attention paid to the people that created our world. And we would love to see that change. In fact, when I went back to university, I created a syllabus that the University of Brandeis accepted because I was an older student. I'd never gotten a degree, and I got tired of telling people that I didn't have a degree. And so I created a syllabus called The History of Innovation and Progress in the Western World. Um, and it, it starts all the way back with Pythagoras, Thales, um, Archimedes was the greatest, I think, intellectual of the classical world. Um, and it just continued, was reborn in the Renaissance with Copernicus and Giordano Bruno, Galileo, Newton. Those are the men to whom we owe a huge debt of gratitude.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
need to include them in the system because that would not be just and would not be fair not to. So how do you do that? Well, in the book, we explain how you can do it in a very practical, down to earth way. And doing it creates certain huge benefits for the current society, the contemporaneous society in which you're creating these entities for people of the past. For instance, we would create a natural estate. That's a concept that's in the book. It would take too long to go into all the gory details, but somebody would create a natural estate for Newton to which people would voluntarily, didn't have to, because in freedom, you don't have to do anything except keep your word. Um, if you don't keep your word, there'll be consequences, but not coercive consequences. Your reputation will
Yeah.
suffer.
But I'm going to dial back the time frame a little bit here, John. On a human time scale, while we're alive, one of the differences between the kind of entrepreneurial thinking that you describe and the behavior of the typical corporation, let's say, is short term versus long term. The Mises calls it time preference, right? Um, I get the impression that you're thinking about this entrepreneurial value creation on a long-term time frame. I mean, more than quarterly earnings reports. Whereas the financial markets tend to drive us towards that short-term thinking. So, how would you resolve that problem?
Um, well, in a different kind of system, you see, what we're aiming for is a system in which there's no legal structure. There's just a market structure, and a market structure is much harder and harsher on producers than the current legal structure is, but it channels producers. I mean, the only harshness from a market system is reality. You gotta deal with reality, and that's difficult. You have to satisfy finicky customers, while at the same time satisfying, in a better world, satisfying, the principles of justice and morality. In other words, treating innovators and your current associates, um, better, allowing them to participate in the prosperity of your company. Um, but, what was the,
Well, we were talking about the short-termism of the typical corporation today. You say that federal and state laws mandate that corporations adopt a business structure that gives financial investors control over companies. I mean, that's the essence of the
Yes,
problem, right?
yes. I mean, it's really when you think about the ideal way to structure a company, it comes out very differently than the legal structure mandates, than the structure that the legal system mandates. Um, and the legal system mandates for a what's called a C corporation that the equity is owned by the financial investors, and that and that it's controlled, and which gives them the control of the company. I mean, you see these proxy fights. Some guy that's never run a business like I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but that's never run a business. Let's just take for an example, somebody wants to take over one of the high tech companies in Silicon Valley, like maybe Parent, which I think is a great current company. And that they can just buy the shares and take it over, and then they control the company. Whereas the entrepreneur that has no protection. And what we're proposing is that the entrepreneur owns 100% of the equity, and financial investors own something called revenue shares. And that's a detailed subject to get into, which we could do on a podcast dedicated to that. But it's very difficult to structure your company that way under the current legal systems.
Yeah. I would like to go into that equity shares versus revenue shares, but not right now. You're right. We'll probably do it another time. Um, but there's another big shift that you're advocating, John, which I think is extremely powerful, and we wrestle with it every day, which is the end of employers and employees.
Yes.
And you're going to substitute a market for that relationship. So let's focus on that. How are you going to end employers and employees?
Well, again, our focus is not on ending what's wrong, but on building what's right. And so we will give up the employer-employee relationship in a gradual evolutionary manner simply because other things work much better for everybody. And if you think about an employee-employer relationship, it's kind of like a vassal-serf kind of thing. And it creates an inherent conflict. Employees wanna be paid more. The entrepreneur, the owners of the company wanna pay them less so they can have higher profit margins. And so it's just a built-in conflict. Whereas with a revenue share, if you're paid via a revenue share as not an employee, but as an associate of the lead entrepreneur, you're paid according to the value you contribute to revenue. And that's determined by the entrepreneur. You and he negotiate an agreement, which is basically compensation via a royalty or a percentage share. And the percentage is structured, it can be structured in many different ways according to particular situations. Um, and so you're completely in alignment. There's no longer any conflict. You negotiate this revenue share with the more revenue the company generates, the more you get paid. Um, and the more that you contribute to that revenue, the more the entrepreneur has to recognize it via enhanced compensation and, a better situation for you and the company, or you will leave and go to another company,
Yeah.
because you're not an employee, you're not locked in.
It's tough to do practically because it's really hard to calculate what one individual in a team or a group or a subsidiary is contributing to value. But I understand the concept. It's a brilliant concept. I like the separation. And that's one example of separating equity shares and revenue shares.
Yes.
Good. Um, so the the resultant system you say is capitalism, primary capitalism. And you have a big concept for that, the social system that develops from market. So everything's going to be a market. You've used a phrase, you want to get away from the legal kind of part of that and make everything a market. Is there a pathway, or are we talking concepts here, John?
The pathway is not guaranteed, it's contingent, and it's difficult, and it's be led by entrepreneurs or it won't happen. I mean, entrepreneurs will either uh, develop a desire to become to move us in the direction of a free cosmic society in which growth is basically irreversible and endless. And it,
And potentially infinite, you say in your book.
oh yeah, I mean, look, infinite is one of those concepts that's really hard to get your head around. But when you understand it correctly, it's potentially infinite. It will not ever achieve infinity, but there's also interesting speculations you can take on that. Because one of the ways I've explained this is we can create a civilization that exists until the end of time and possibly beyond. And you go, boy, how can you go beyond time? That's a cliffhanger. That
Yeah,
it's there's a
you-
hint in David Deutsch's book.
I was going to say you're David Deutsch territory there.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, there is an aspect which is part of our book, which you haven't touched on yet, and it's what Galambos called the critical juncture. So these aren't just theoretical ideas to discuss and maybe implement. The critical junctures, we've arrived at a species at a point where we have the physical science to destroy ourselves, but not the social science to back away from the cliff. So there is a component of time intensity here that, and I see you think we see some of this in Musk. We have to get off planet and we have to do things because we are in a precarious position. So part of this theory is at this critical junction, we need to move ahead
Yes.
sooner rather than later because the alternative.
It's urgent.
And do you, Columbus, explain why, as a civilization, we've got to this critical juncture that we're more likely to destroy ourselves than get to infinite value extension? Is there a reason for that?
Well, it's a simple process of, I mean, we start out as a species completely ignorant. You know, the first guy, I mean, culture didn't start until the first hominid developed a tool, and passed that knowledge on to the next generation. And so knowledge is cumulative and it gets better. I mean, it's one of the most interesting aspects of knowledge and markets. They are the two phenomenon that accumulate and get better with time and are irreversible. I mean, once you know Newton's law of gravitation, you're not going to go back to the pre-Newtonian world, unless, you know, the political system overwhelms us and we have a civilizational collapse. But once you get things like once knowledge is used, see, we haven't had the knowledge to know how to channel knowledge into tools rather than weapons. And so once you get this knowledge and states start developing things like nuclear arsenals, we're in grave danger. And we, you know, it's urgent that we need to get the hell out of this situation and get onto an evolutionary track towards a freer society. Um, you know, again, we can expand endlessly into the cosmos and achieve there's a phrase I haven't used in this interview yet, but it's a very important one. To get to a condition of stabilized, durable growth. In other words, growth has to be stable and not blow up, but it has to be dynamic and it has to be the kind of growth that can last forever, that can keep going forever on this kind of irreversible, better track, the better and better.
Mike, you were trying to get a word in there.
Well, attention, evolution always goes towards sustaining life, but our tendency is always to destroy because the first spear was created to hunt animals and then it becomes a weapon. The wheel is created to move carts and it goes on chariots. So working against us is this propensity, like Don says, to weaponize progress. So how do we move away and use progress toward stable, durable civilization versus extinction? There's an evolutionary tension there that's been there from the beginning. So a good idea and a way to make it profitable to go down the path of survival and prosperity versus, entropy and extinction. That's more than a theoretical discussion. That's a big part of where we're at right now.
Okay, so we're going to have to wrap up for time shortly, but I want to cover one more word that is in the title of your book and we haven't really mentioned yet, and that is it's a blueprint for a spacefaring civilization, spacefaring. And we're in the context of Elon Musk and SpaceX. He just launched the 10th version of his heavy rocket just a couple of days before we're recording, and they hit every experimental goal that they had, right? And they brought it all back. It was wonderful. But why spacefaring? Why do we introduce, and why does Elon introduce that idea of getting beyond Earth and into a bigger space?
Well, if we're going to keep expanding and growing, and if you're a living thing, you either grow or you die. I mean, that's just the way it is. The only place we can really expand into is space. I mean, other than knowledge. I mean, one of the beautiful things about knowledge is it's intangible. You can expand and create knowledge without, you know, well, I mean, people worry about using up resources. I mean, anybody that worries about that has no understanding of the vastness of our cosmos. I mean, there are 2 trillion galaxies, each made up of about somewhere between 500 and trillion stars. I mean, it's just huge. Um, at last count, it was 2 trillion. We haven't found the end of the universe yet.
So we go spacefaring for access to more resources? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
it's just we're curious. We wanna learn, we wanna explore, we wanna understand the universe, and if you wanna understand it from a scientific basis, observational corroboration is part of that. You wanna go and access all or explore all its accessible domains, because we don't know what's out there. We're at the very beginning of a real civilization, and at the beginning of knowledge. I mean, we are, an advanced alien civilization. If they came and visited us, which who knows, maybe I don't, but the odds seem to favor that there are other, intelligent beings out there. Um, they would say, "God, these people are so primitive," but they're no more primitive than us, because, as David Deutsch puts it, we're always near the beginning of infinity, no matter how much progress we've made. So there's I mean, Isaac Newton has this wonderful quote where he says, "I don't know what I seem to others, but to myself, I've just been a little boy walking along the seashore, finding a prettier shell than other people, while the vast ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." And that we'll always be at that place, always. I mean, there's a concept in science called the final theory of everything. No, that'll never happen. There's no final theory. The moment you get a final theory of everything, somebody will come up with a better.
The next one, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna wrap it up there for time. We've hit our time allotment, but that's an exciting place to leave it, right? The infinite promise,
Yeah.
and you've wrapped it up with Isaac Newton and Elon Musk. So thank you, John Deming. Thank you, Mike Hamel. The book's a blueprint for a spacefaring civilization. The Science of Volition. We'll provide a link to it, and some other reference points. Is there anywhere else that you'd like people to find you, John?
Well, we're gonna do a website, but it's not, it's in preparation. It'll be ready in 3 to 6 months, maybe sooner.
Okay. Well, we'll have you back again, and maybe you can tell us about your progress in that direction. And we never got into the negatives of the political system and why it can't help us succeed. So we might do that in another discussion. But thank you both very much. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hunter. We really appreciate the opportunity.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode. And check hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.